No, I've had a very strong feeling, like I said earlier, about justice and fairness and what's right. And so there were just certain things that drove me, because I said, this just isn't right. It isn't fair. And so I was driven, in more of a radical direction, rather than how the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, they were marching very peacefully. I just didn't think I had it in me to be that peaceful. If somebody has squirted me with water and sickened dogs on me, and that kind of thing, what they went through, that just wasn't me. I just wasn't.
So we're excited. He has an amazing story to tell about growing up in Orange County, growing up specifically Santa Ana, and experienced a lot of things. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Daniel. Let's do a round of applause for Daniel. And what we're going to do is we're just going to do a real live oral history session. So oral history is somewhat of an in-depth interview with our narrator, and he's going to share his experience. And so I have questions here, but as we get started, can you just state your full name?
Daniel Michael Lynem.
So
now they tag on senior to that. So
that's So let's maybe we should just start there, because I know you as Daniel Lynem, but a lot of people also know you as Michael Lynem. So maybe why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, this goes back to my birth, actually. My father's name was Daniel, but his middle initial was B. He was Ben. He didn't want a junior. So my dad claims that he told my mom, because back then you couldn't go in the delivery room, you had to wait outside, that he told her that he wanted my name Michael Daniel Lynem. And so my mom says that she totally forgot. And so when they asked her what they wanted to name me, she did it Daniel Michael. So my dad said, we're calling him Michael, and that's it. So for years, whenever I would do anything, go to a new school or go to a job, I had to train people to call me Michael because of my first name being Daniel. And that would take sometimes 2 or 3 weeks to get everybody acclimated. So probably about 16, 17 years ago, in kind of the mid to late 90s, I just got tired of doing it. And so whenever I went anywhere, people would call me Daniel. I just started answering to it. So I switched from Michael to Daniel, so now I'm Daniel. Yeah.
So it just depends on how long you've known Daniel for, right? So if you've known him for like pre-1990s, then it's Michael.
Yes.
And post, it's Daniel.
Yeah.
So
here's some Michael guys right here. Guys I grew up with right here. These are some Michael guys.
So can you just tell us when and where you were born?
I was born in Santa Ana, California, Santa Ana Community Hospital, January 14th, 1947. My mom says it was in the morning, about 7 a.m. So that got everything started.
And can you talk just a little bit about your parents? Parents' names?
Yeah, my mom's name is Lucille Elizabeth Harris was her maiden name, and my dad is Daniel Ben Lynem. And my mom grew up. She was born in Kentucky, a little place called Lawrenceburg, probably about 20 miles outside of Frankfort, and about 35 miles from Louisville. And my dad was originally from Milford, Ohio, and 16 kids in that family. And so my grandfather moved from Milford to Indianapolis, so that's where my dad grew up, and that's where he met my mom. So during World War II, my father was in the Army. They ended up eventually, he got stationed in Orange County, and that's how they ended up in Santa Ana at that point.
So, and that's actually a really important part that you mentioned, is your dad coming out here for the military. World War II was a huge turning point for Orange County. And a lot of African Americans that ended up being moving and living in Orange County, the reason why they came out here was because of the military.
Because of the military, yes.
Do you remember much growing up and being engaged in the military with your dad?
I just remember we bought a little house on 4th Street in Santa Ana. I think they paid $4,400 for it. And so, but it's interesting that when they first came into Santa Ana, there were so few African Americans here that there was a family called the Hatchers. I remember Mr. and Mrs. Hatcher. And so they were kind of like a point where whenever any African Americans moved into Santa Ana, they would go live with them. They'd give them an opportunity to get work, get on your feet, and then move out. So the Hatchers were huge. They lived on 5th Street in Santa Ana. And so my dad was in the Army. I don't remember much about it. I was pretty young at the time. I remember one thing. I was probably about 3 years old. And where we didn't live too far from Bristol Street. And the big place there was Bristol Drugstore. And I just remember being found sitting on the curb with cigarette butts in my mouth, smoking some cigarette butts, and my dad came and got me from there. But then after he got out of the Army, he almost immediately joined the Navy, got involved in the Korean the Korean War after that.
And your hometown, your home on 4th Street, it's still there.
Yes.
It's still there. I think it's, what is it? I
forgot the address.
I can't forget,
yeah.
but it's still there, and I drive by it almost daily.
Yeah, it's still there.
Can you talk a little bit about your mom? I know she was very, very active in the community. So can you talk about Lucille?
Yeah, my mom was she was an amazing woman who loved the Lord. And so she tells the story. She would tell me, she said, you started going to church when you were born, so while you were in the womb. So I just remember my mom, she was a very soft-spoken person, very hard worker, but she could be very, very aggressive at the same time. I don't have much recollection of this, but she was involved with the group that founded the first NAACP chapter in Orange County in Santa Ana. Her and Harriet Woodard, who you interviewed a couple of years ago. They became very good friends. My mom was very active in the community. One thing that stands out about my mom to me was she had, I have to call it a gift, she had the amazing gift of forgiveness. The things that she would forgive people for, it just literally blew my mind. She just had this soft heart, and she just had this ability to forgive people for some things were very horrendous, but she was a wonderful Christian woman. She loved the Lord. She got me into church. I was there until I was old enough to rebel. But she tells me that she prayed for me, every single day of my life, and trusting God to draw me to Him. So.
And I had the opportunity to go up to UC Berkeley a few years ago and look through all the NAACP records. So I came across the charter of the NAACP, and your mom's name was on it. So I think she was the secretary.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
What else do you remember about your mom?
I remember my mom. She was always very, very involved. She started, her and Harriet Woodard started the Interested Citizens of Santa Ana, and they would have events. We had to have our dinners that they would sell at church, of course. But they would have different events and raise money, and then they would give scholarships away to a number of deserving young African Americans in the community. And they were diligent, in going about that and doing that. So I just remember my mom being very active, very caring. And when my friends would come over, she would always ask them, Charles, when you come into church? Clarence, when you come into church? Right? So, yeah. My mom was very diligent in that. Lovely woman.
And so we're turning now to you. What do you remember growing up as a child in Santa Ana?
Well, the first thing I remember, we bought a house on 7th Street in Santa Ana when we moved from 4th Street. And I remember my parents talking about that to get this house, they had to go to court to get it. Because it was an all-white neighborhood, and they didn't want to sell it to black people. And it's interesting, kind of the whole real estate concept at that particular time. So they eventually got the house. We were the first black family to move on that street. And I was probably 5 years old, 1952. And kind of one of the things I remember is that I remember waking up one morning. I don't know if it was the next morning or when it was. You know how things are big when you're a kid. And I just remember walking outside. And when I walked outside on the sidewalk, it seemed like all I could see was for sale signs all up and down the street on both sides of the street. And I just thought that just went up overnight. So it was kind of amazing. But the concept was, and I actually ran into one of the real estate agents years later at a CBMC function that told me that what they would do is that they got the black family in there. Then they would go to all the white families and tell them, better sell your house, and you better get out while you can, because the property values are now going to go down. Okay, so that was the concept. And of course, they got all that business, as a result of that. So that's something that kind of stood out to me in that area. Not all the families moved out. I developed some great friendships, and we did a lot of things together on that block. But some families eventually did move. They came down and told us they hated to move, but they were losing their investment in their home. So I remember that.
So it's really interesting because it just add a little bit of context to that. The neighborhood where blacks were allowed to live in was a little like square. It was between First Street and Fifth Street and Bristol and what is now Rate. It used to be called Artesia. So your family was really one of the first families to move outside of that.
Yes.
And even though it was just two blocks away,
Yeah.
It caused an uproar.
It did.
And this was in the early 50s, so this was prior to a lot of what we consider now Little Texas, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later.
Yes. It is really interesting too, Kevin, because we moved on a street between Pacific and which is now Rate. And that's where they moved, that's where a lot of the Hispanics lived and the blacks lived in that area. Just east of Pacific, remained all white. And they didn't let any blacks move just a block away. Some of the white people that lived on the block we were in actually bought houses in the next block over because they were guaranteed that they weren't going to sell to any blacks on that particular area. So it's really kind of interesting.
What elementary school did you go to?
I went to a number of them, but the one that I spent the most time out was Wilson Elementary School on Washington and Santa Ana.
And something happened at Wilson, right?
Yes. It's interesting, and we'll probably get into this, because I spent a lot of time in the South also, but the worst racism that I experienced in my life was actually in California, and it was actually in Orange County. When I was going to Wilson, I was in the 4th grade at the time, and so there was only 2 of us blacks that were there at the school, myself and my cousin. And I had a neighbor, my next door neighbor, a friend of mine, that we were at that school. Well, just about every single day, at recess, at lunch, and after school, there would be just a bunch of these white boys that would throw rocks at us and just nigger us all day long. But of course they were far enough away where we couldn't catch them, not that we didn't try. But I remember that I would tell my mom about it, and she would say, well, you need to talk to the teacher, you need to tell somebody. And so I would. So I went one time and told one of the teachers what was going on. And she said, well, let me take you over to Mr. Emley's office. Mr. Emley was the principal there at Wilson Elementary School. And so she took me over to his office, and when she dropped me off, he says, okay, you can leave now. So it was me and him in the office, and he looked at me and he says, so what's your problem? And I said, well, these kids are calling us niggers and they're throwing rocks at us. And he looked at me and he said, what's wrong with that? He said, you are a nigger. And so, I was kind of stunned. And then he came over, he picked me up from the back of my neck, lifted me off the ground, and carried me all the way across the playground and then slammed me on a bench. And he told me, he said, you and your kind, I better not ever catch you in this part of the playground or this part of the school ever again. And it was, it was so traumatic that, I was bleeding at my neck and everything. So I went home, and of course I told my parents, and I told my dad. And so the next day, probably the only time I remember, my dad drove me to school. We went in the office, and my dad just said, I thought he was going to talk to the receptionist, and say, I need to talk to Mr. Emley. Well, he said, you stand right there. And I just remember he just went past everything, went into Mr. Emley's office. I heard stuff like it was being knocked around and things like that was going on. And when he came out, I just heard him saying, he said, you ever put your hands on my boy again? He said, I'll kill you. And so he came out of the office. We didn't see Mr. Emley for about 4 days after that. When we did see him, he was wearing sunglasses. So, you can only imagine what happened. But my dad told me, he says, I work with that guy. He said, he's a Ku Klux Klan guy. He's a low-down racist. And that there was a Ku Klux Klan chapter, as you know, actually in Orange County that was quite functional, in the early part of the century. So that was just, was one of my experiences, at Wilson Elementary School.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that Orange County was known for segregation. This was in the 50s, but from the 1920s to the 1940s, they had segregated schools in Orange County. And although it wasn't necessarily for African Americans or blacks, because there were such a limited amounts, it was for students of Hispanic descent, Mexican descent. And that case went to California Supreme Court, and eventually ended segregation in California, which helped 10 years later with Brown versus Board of Education that ended segregation, nationwide. But it's a horrible experience that you went through.
Yes, that was one experience.
Some other things also happened at school, right?
Yeah, refresh my memory.
I know you had some run-ins at Santa Ana High.
Yeah, I had run-ins at Santa Ana High. I had run-ins I went to Willard Junior High School. I had situations there. Everywhere I went, I had situations, I mean, you couldn't get away from them. But, at Santa Ana High, it was sometimes very blatant at Santa Ana High. I remember we had one of our instructors, and you guys remember this, Mr. Thurston, I believe his name was. He would regularly, when we would go to PE and we had to pick teams, and so when we would pick teams, well, the Hispanic students and us, we stayed together. We were the minority in the school, so we pretty much stuck together. And when we would pick each other on a team, he would say things like, he said, that's pretty typical. He said, you beaners and you niggers stick together. So the racism, that I experienced in school, whether it was junior high school or high school, was pretty blatant. Or he would say things like, just talk about, he said, ain't your mammy on a pancake box, and those kind of things. And so we went through that all throughout high school and everything. So
why do you think that was so prevalent in this area?
I think that Orange County was kind of known as a pretty conservative area. And one of the things it was known as, I remember in the 50s, 60s, and also some of the 70s, was being the John Birch Society was very, very strong at that time here. And so, I remember one time I had a teacher attack me in a classroom physically, and me and my mom, there was a young black attorney, the first African-American attorney to move into Orange County. He had just got his office. And so we ended up making a case out of this, and we got him, of course, my mom says, we got this young black lawyer, we need to get him a case. We were his first case. We went in his office, he barely had any furniture, but he took the case, gave us an appointment for that following Thursday, and when we went back and knocked on the door, there was nobody there. We peeked through the windows, all the furniture was gone. We checked the home that him and his wife had lived in, and they were all gone. We found out later that a group of men in Santa Ana, a group of white men, had went to him and told him that he needed to pack his bags, he needed to get out of town, or else, they were going to take him and his family completely out. So of course he ended up leaving as quickly as possible. These are the kind of things that you hear about today that happened in the South. A lot of the racism in the South, and a lot of those experiences. But it happened here quite frequently, and sometimes it was really pretty brutal at the same time. And it was consistent.
That you mentioned the South. Let's maybe you want to share a little bit about going to Kentucky. Obviously, that's where your mom grew up from.
Yes.
Grew up and lived, and you would go back and visit and stay the summers over there.
Yeah, my grandmother was a school teacher, and the school room that they taught in was old school, had a potbelly stove in the middle of the schoolroom. And my mother actually went to school there, and my grandmother taught there eventually about 40 plus years. So I would go back to Kentucky to live with my grandmother and to go to school in a lot of my elementary years. And at the time, Jim Crow was absolutely the law of the land. So it was strict segregation. You had the colored water fountains, and you had the bathrooms for the coloreds, and a lot of your restaurants. You had sidewalks that were for whites only. And you had restaurants that would have signs in the window, we don't serve Negroes, we don't serve coloreds. Some of them were blatant enough to say we don't serve niggers and that kind of thing. And you could only go in through certain doors in certain businesses, movie house, and sit in certain seats. And but everybody, the segregation was so strict that there was no conflict. You know, you didn't have, people weren't picking on you and doing things to you because we went to a separate school and we lived in a separate neighborhood. I think I remember that. I don't think I ever, in all the time I was there, ever saw a police officer in the black part of town. Never. We were allowed to basically police ourselves, and kind of take care of ourselves and take care of each other. So it was a different environment. I wasn't attacked and I did have a couple of incidents at the theater we went to. I had a kid, he calls me a nigger. I beat him up, I didn't lose many fights, but I was very careful. I was very careful about the opponents that I picked, So, but anyway, we were probably about 9 or 10 years old. And so at this point, me from California, whenever I would come to town, everybody knew Miss Katie's grandson from California is here. And so, and the people, I expected the people to be kind of mean, but actually they were very respectful of my grandmother. Whenever we went somewhere, they were very respectful with her. People got along, But there was this clear line in terms of social interaction and so on and so forth. So that day, and I would tell my cousin, I said, you know what, I'm sick of this going in the back door of the theater. I'm going through the front door today. And so I did. I went up and they actually let me through the door. The manager would look at the guy at the door and he'd give him a little look. They let me in. They actually let me buy stuff at the concession stand that we normally couldn't do. And I went and sat wherever I wanted to sit. And I remember this kid, and you have to remember, we were just kids. He's a product of his environment and his values. And he was a few rows up from me. And when he turned around to look at me, he went to smile. It was like he was missing a couple teeth. I didn't know that. And his eye was swollen. And he looked at me and he says, "I'm going to get you, guy." And I looked at him and I says, "Yeah, I'm going to beat you up again." And we actually laughed about it. We were just kids. But that was, that was an experience that kind of stood out.
Did you ever talk to your grandma about how different it was coming from Orange County and then going to Kentucky?
She had to really kind of temper my behavior, a lot, because I've always kind of had an attitude of justice and fairness and what's right. And so coming from California, of course, we didn't have those restrictions, those segregated restrictions. So there were things that I thought was just flat out wrong. And so it was hard for me to submit to those things. So I would do things that was against what they were doing. But the people were actually very gracious because like the theater thing, by the time I got home, my grandmother was there, the pastor was there, and a couple other adults were there, and they said, "We got to talk to you." And they would very graciously say, "You can't do that here." They said, "You can't act like that." My grandmother would say, if we were in the deeper South, if we were in like Alabama, Louisiana, or Georgia, she says, they would come and take you in the middle of the night and they would hang you and lynch you. She said, there wouldn't be anything I could do about it. Well, for a period of time, that kind of scared some sense into me, and so I kind of went along with the program, a little bit after that. But yeah, she would talk to me about a lot of those things.
So very different experience, huh?
Yeah, very different. Then come to California, and you just got slammed, Yeah.
So your mom was obviously part of the NAACP, and so she probably encountered these things, knew about these things. What did she ever mention? Did she ever talk about these issues that were going on, and what maybe the leaders in the community were trying to do to kind of confront these issues?
My mom, I think, people coming from the South didn't necessarily confront the system, okay? They pretty much, like my grandmother, they took what they had, they said, this is where we're at, this is our situation, this is what we're doing, and we're going to grow that. So they took great pride in education, in educating people and pushing the issue of education. They developed their own institutions. I went to school there for a while in high school called Lincoln Institute, which was an all-black high school, a boarding school there. So in the South, they knew exactly what was going on, and I think as a result of that, they built some tremendous strength of character and ability to go forth, and they just focused on their community and making sure that their kids did the best that they could. And the issue was that you have to be better. Okay, you have to be better than the next guy. You can't just be a C and when you're competing and have the white kid be a C. you've got to be the A plus, because you've got to stand out. So they pushed those values and pushed those principles in that environment. And so a lot of the blacks that came from the South here brought those values and principles with them. So my mom never talked about confronting anybody. You didn't hear anything her saying bad thing about white people, or we hate this person, hate that person. They were just about, we're going to take what we got. This is what we've been given, and God has given us this, and He's blessed us with this, and we need to just work within the confines of what we have. And so she felt very blessed, to be able to do that and to work from that position.
Well, that makes sense. So, some of the interactions that really took place within the community focused a lot around the church.
Yes.
There wasn't too much social activity other than the church. Mm-hmm. So what do you recall about the church, and why was it so important to this small black community that was really kind of Santa Ana?
I think when you talk about the black church, you have to go back historically, to the days of slavery and after and Reconstruction. When even during slavery, the church was a place where the only place where blacks were basically for a while allowed to congregate together. Other than that, they weren't really allowed to congregate together. So the church became a source for a lot of social interaction among slaves. In post-slavery, also it became a place of community, a place of where people just did a lot of things together. During slavery, if you look at the history, you'll find that the church was a place where they planned revolts, against the system. They planned escapes during the Underground Railroad from there. And so, a lot of the culture in the black church, a lot of our history is tied to that. And so it kind of grew down from there. So the church just became a place where people congregated, where you fellowshiped, where you got a chance to get with other people in your community. And it was always done around food. It was always done around food, which was great. And so the church played a big part. And so basically, whoever was the pastor or the leaders in the church, they were the ones that were recognized as the spokespeople and the leaders in the community, and spoke for that. And that history was right here. If you look at Second Baptist, and some of the pastors that we've had in Orange County, they were the ones that were working with, say, the police department and the city governments and other different institutions, to try to make things better in the community.
And was that your church growing up, Second Baptist?
We went to Second Baptist in Long Beach, for a while. That's where I went for a long time. It was actually at the church in Long Beach that I came to really comprehend and understand the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's where, it was at that church when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I remember comprehending and understanding that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He was God in human flesh, and that He came here, He lived a life as us and for us, and He died and paid for our sins. And so I came to pretty much a basic understanding of the gospel, and that understanding in that environment eventually would play a role, in my salvation, through Christ.
So one of the other things that you mentioned as you're talking about bringing the community together was everyone gathered around food.
Food, yes.
So can you talk a little bit about food and what you remembered about food and what you liked eating and what everyone was eating?
Well, what I remember about it is it was good. It was good. Of course, we had chicken and usually once a year we have chitlins. For those who don't know what chitlins are, they are pig intestines. Of course, you got to clean them before you eat them, But I mean, we just did everything around food. We'd have dinners. We'd sell pies. All the women would get together and make these fantastic meals, and we would sell them. That's how we raised money, to do certain things and certain events and to do things in the community. And so everything was done around food, and so it was absolutely great. The food was good. My favorite, of course, we had chicken and black-eyed peas and greens and cornbread, and my mom made the bomb biscuits from scratch. She made just this awesome peach cobbler and apple pie, you name it. Lemon meringue pie. it was just absolutely fantastic. So missed some of that food, but it was good.
So a lot of social interactions took place within the church, and one of the things that was very limited for African Americans in the county was jobs. And one of the things that developed were people began their own businesses. A lot of salons, a lot of barbershops. And that was another place of interaction, another place of kind of solidarity within the community. What do you remember about those particular areas?
The barbershop, that was a place to be. If you wanted to hear, you wanted to hear the tall tales and the short tales. It was a place to be. It was such a camaraderie and social interaction. Where men got together and just shared with each other. You would go to the barbershop even if you weren't getting your hair cut. Just to hang out with with a number of guys. And so we had, I remember we had Duke's Barbershop in Santa Ana, and then we had the other one, the name escapes me, I remember on 4th Street. It was two brothers over there that had that shop right down from Bristol Drugstore. You remember that one? Yeah.
I can't remember the name though.
Yeah, but and then we had Kelly's Barbershop, that was on 1st Street. And so that's the place where we would go there and you just sit around and talk. And if you were younger, you just go to listen to the older guys, tell stories. And so it was a great time. We had a great time together.
As a younger kid going to those barbershops to hear the older generation tell stories, what are some of the things that you recall from the older generation trying to teach you or share what they've experienced?
A lot of it was just that, they would share wisdom. A lot of it was fun, and it was, we laughed a lot. We laughed a lot. And a lot of the men they would talk about the past, and they would give us advice on, you need to do this. And it was always about hard work. You mentioned about how a lot of African Americans started businesses. My dad started a janitorial service. After he got out of the service, he worked for the post office for a while, but he went to work for himself. He had a very successful janitorial service. My mom worked for herself. You kind of did what you did. She cleaned homes in the rich areas down in Newport Beach and Laguna and down there. She did that for, basically for her whole life. Made a very good living, for herself and for me and raising me and everything. So it was, sometimes you hear these tall tales of stories, but basically somebody would turn to you at some point and say, you better pay attention, youngster, and you better listen up here and you take this advice. But they would give you advice, just a lot of wisdom, shared in those situations.
And then just to add a little bit of context to that, since there was such a limited amount in terms of population of African Americans in the community, the typical jobs that would have been in agriculture and things of that nature, that was really employed by Hispanics, Japanese, some of the other ethnic groups that had larger communities. So it wasn't really a place for blacks to work. So starting businesses, there was a lot of businesses started. Shoe shine.
Shoe shine, yeah.
You remember shoe shiners?
Yeah, they had shoe shine. Matter of fact, a friend of mine, a guy I grew up with, named Richard Fox, Dickie Fox, who I called him a friend from the womb because his mom and my mom were best of friends, and they were pregnant with us at the same time. And Dickie and I were actually born 2 days apart. I was born on the 14th, he was born on the 16th. So we stayed friends. I got pictures of him at our house on 4th Street. And so we stayed friends for all these years. He passed away a few years back. And the redeeming thing is that he gave his life to Christ before he took his last breath. So I know we'll see him again. But we had Dickie and I we would go to the movies. It was Broadway theater. It was Broadway and West Coast theater. And we would go down there to the movies, and so we could get in and have some money to buy popcorn, we would take our shoe shine boxes with us. And we stand on the corner of 4th Street in front of J.C. Penney's, and we would shine shoes for 15 cents, 20 cents, whatever, until we raised. It was like 50 cents quarter to get in the movies, popcorn and soda wasn't that much. So we would sit there on the corner and shine shoes for a couple hours until we raised enough money to go to the movies. And then we only had 2 movies, but we'd go in there and stay all day. We just stayed for the cartoon, So we would let it cycle, and then we just come back to the cartoon again. So we'd stay in there all day long. So that's what we used to do.
So let's switch gears a little bit. And you had mentioned that in the South and some of the younger generation or the older generation, they learned how to work around the system.
Yes.
You know, if they didn't have schools for us, let's make our own schools.
Mm-hmm.
Let's police let's do our things within our community. The 60s ended up being a real kind of crazy time, not just around the nation, but also here in Orange County.
Yes.
And that kind of just led to the rise of the Panthers.
Yes.
And this was your generation. You know, it wasn't the older generation really kind of looking, we're not going to, you know, like you said, your mom, we didn't want to try to maybe confront the issue, but it seemed like your generation really wanted to confront the issue. So can you talk about what was happening in the 60s from a youth perspective that really kind of opened your eyes to we need to do something about this?
You know, it was just, it was kind of your everyday life experiences. And it was like, you know, I could leave my house to go to the store, you know, to buy a soda. And chances are I was going to get pulled over, you know, for no particular reason. And, you know, searched and patted down and spread them, you know, get up against the wall kind of thing. So that was a kind of a common practice. And that was what was going on in the community. Found out a few years later that the police department's policy was, and this was an official policy of how they trained their officers, was that they were told whenever you come in contact with a black male of any age, you are to refer to him as boy. And so that was a common practice. And so sometimes you could be doing nothing, walking down the street, and you just got pulled over. And so it was a constant kind of a harassment, you know, that was going on, and the unfairness of it and the injustice of it. And so, you know, I think up in Oakland, where the Black Panthers started, where Huey Newton and Bobby Seale actually formed the party up there, was the original title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And so they began to patrol the police, and they developed a little law book that told you what your rights was. So whenever they would see the police pulling over any people in the community, they would also pull over and make sure that they had the book and they knew what their rights were. But the interesting thing about it that gave rise to who the Panthers were was that when they patrolled the police and they got out of the car, they were armed. You know, they had guns. So there's a whole interesting history there. So my experience was that, you know, I've had a very strong feeling, like I said earlier, about justice and fairness and what's right. And so there were just certain things that drove me, because I said, this just isn't right, it isn't fair. And so I was driven, you know, in more of a radical direction, you know, rather than how the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, they were marching very peacefully. I just didn't think I had it in me to be that peaceful if somebody has squirted me with water and sickened dogs on me, you know, and that kind of thing, what they went through. That just wasn't me. I just was not going to put up with that kind of thing. So I had a more radical bent to me, you know, and so I wanted something done, and I wanted it done radically and intensely, and to make some serious change and to send a message. You know, let's send a message to the system, you know, to the institutions, and let them know we're not putting up with this, and we're willing to meet force with force.
So before we get into how the party started in here, I want, and this is something that we've talked about in the past, walking down Wright Street and going to El Salvador Park, because that was the park. That was the park where everyone got together, and just talk about what you kids would encounter going down Wright Street.
We would have, they had a dance on Wright Street every Wednesday night. And so people from, you know, this is where all the black kids came from. And we're going to talk about the area called Little Texas and Santa Ana. And so we would all go to this dance on Wednesday night at El Salvador Park. And so every Wednesday night, when it came time for the dance to be over and to end, well, the police would actually have a staging area, and they would stage 4, 5, 6 police cars in a particular area. And then when we came out of the dance and people were walking down Wright Street to go home, and you were walking in groups, almost any Wednesday night during the same time, you could actually go down Wright Street and there would be groups of young black kids stopped at different points up the street by the police. Now, nobody was doing anything wrong. That was a pattern, because the police department's philosophy and thing was kind of like an occupying army in a third world country. They were there to control us. That was their thoughts and their attitudes. And they were controlling us through intimidation and through abuse and harassment.
So let's go to that turning point. That turning point of when the Panther Party started, and how did that come about? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, it eventually started in Oakland with Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, but my involvement in the Panther Party, there was a gentleman in Santa Ana named Tommy Crockett. He had a record store in Santa Ana on Bristol. So we went by there looking at records one night, and he claimed to be a member of the Black Panther. Well, that appealed to me, because I have this radical mindset. So we started the meeting at a little place on First Street on the corner of First and Rate now, over there. And so got involved in that, come to find out at some point in time that we were not really a Black Panther official site. So some of the guys in LA at the Southern California chapter got wind of that, and they came down and exercised some violence on Mr. Crockett and some other people. It was, I won't get into the details of that, but it ended up, when they left, they appointed me as the head and the leader of the Black Panther office in Santa Ana, in Orange County.
And so when I think you should go into those details of what happened,
okay,
Tommy.
So I'll do that. So, but anyway, we had a meeting. I went to breakfast. They came down that morning. I went to breakfast with Elmer Geronimo Pratt and some of his guys. If you look up Elmer Pratt, he's passed away now, but he was the Deputy Minister of Defense for the Southern California chapter, and basically the head of that chapter. So we went to breakfast and exchanged some information. We came back to the office. They put everybody in a circle, okay? And there was this one guy named Blue. He was like Tommy's. He was like Geronimo's enforcer. And so while we were in the circle, they were interrogating everybody. They were interrogating Tommy and some of his right-hand people. And I just remember at a certain point, Blue walked up behind Tommy. They had their weapons out. Blue and a couple other guys were walking around the circle, and they just cracked him upside the head with that 45. Busted him upside the head, knocked him out of the chair. Busted another guy upside the head with the 45, knocked him out of the chair, and so they sent a message. And so at that point, after that situation was over, was when they said, you guys are now down here, and that's when they appointed me as the head of the Orange County chapter. And
what did that mean to you personally?
Well, one of the things it meant to me was that, I was kind of like, yeah, that's right on. Let's clean this madness up here. Let's get going. But it told me that these guys were serious, and that not only would they do that to people that they considered to be traitors or possible agents. They call them agents provocateurs. Is what they call people who have maybe infiltrated the party from police or FBI and so on and so forth. So it meant to me that, this is serious, and it's starting, and it's on now. So we need to get busy.
And if I remember correctly, I was just reading this the other day. Tommy Crockett was part of another group, and I think it was I think a CCC, and it meant for something. But yeah, it's really fascinating. So what are some of the things? Party started. About how many people were in your party, in your group, in your chapter here in Santa Ana?
We probably had, full-time active members in the group. We probably didn't have any more than about 4 or 5 of us, that were the core that did everything and put everything together and organized different things and situations. We had our uniforms, which was, we had the Vietnam combat boots. We had black slacks, black turtleneck shirt, a black leather jacket, and black berets. So that was our dress uniform that we wore. And all the Panthers, nationwide, that's how we dressed. That's what we did. So it had a kind of an intimidating effect. So when we went out doing things in the community, or confronting people, or confronting businesses or business owners in the community, we would dress like that, in a very intimidating way.
And how did you, the other core members of the party, how did they get recruited? Were they friends of yours growing up, or they were just interested in the party?
Yeah, but most of them were friends of mine growing up that I grew up with, and we all started together. You know, when we first met Tommy and that whole situation, at the office, they were part of that. So, and then Tommy and a couple other guys, they just faded away, which is probably a wise thing for them to do at that point.
And then, remembering names, you had Otis Grimes.
Ricky Tice.
Ricky Tice, that's right. And Steve Tice.
Steve Tice. Steve Tice was a little bit later. He was younger, so he wasn't intensely, involved. And there were a couple of the guys that started with, I don't remember their names, right offhand, but yeah. And then eventually, I met Arthur League, and then Arthur League came in. He was a full-time member that became very active with us.
And also, so I want to also clear some things up, because I think there's some misconceptions about the Black Panther Party. Obviously, it was self-defense, but there was also a lot of community programs that you were doing trying to help the Black community. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, one of the things I should probably state is that, the Black Panther Party got labeled as a racist organization that hated white people. And that was about as far from the truth it could actually be. One of the things I think that got the Black Panthers so noticed by authorities and officials was that our philosophy was Marxist-Leninist, to its very core. We were basically communists, socialists. That's what we pushed. That was the philosophy of the party. And so some of the things that we did, there was a 10-point program. And I think basically if anybody read that 10-point program and you didn't know that it belonged to the Black Panther Party, you would be like, these are very reasonable demands. We wanted to have some sovereign control in our own communities. We wanted to have some say-so about education. We wanted the police harassment and things, that kind of stuff to stop. And so basically the core was that we wanted the same kind of say-so in our community that other people had in their community. And it really not much difference, but because we latched on to a philosophy at the time, this is like close to the MacArthur era, and communism was really, really a bad thing. And so, but that became our thing, we related to Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Chairman Mao, and we related to Che Guevara, was one of our heroes. And so we considered ourselves revolutionaries to the core.
Can you talk about some of the programs that you did for the community?
One of the programs that I was very involved in, that we started here in Orange County, and I also ran part of that program in Los Angeles, was the Breakfast for Children program. And so, the basic position was that children can't learn on an empty stomach. And so we knew that a lot of the kids in our community, because, single parenting and so on and so forth, they weren't getting breakfast before they went to school, which was a problem. So that was one of the problems. It started nationwide. Every Black Panther office basically had a Breakfast for Children program. So we would bring children to the office. We'd go get them and bring them to the office and feed them breakfast. And I also worked, I did the newsletter in LA. And one of the things we did, I'd go around the community and interview the people in the community, and elderly people who needed to get to medical appointments and to see doctors. Well, we would go and pick them up, and take them to doctors. In Oakland, they had a food giveaway program up in Oakland where they gave away tons and bags of food to the community to keep them going. So it was a very community-based program. We just wanted to do for our community what we thought people were doing for their community, and having some say-so in that.
And outside, so the outside of perception of the Black Panther Party might have been very negative, but within the Black community, how did the rest of the community treat you guys and interact with you?
With a lot of respect.
That's good.
Mm-hmm. They better respect it.
But you guys were also armed, right?
Yes, we were.
How'd you guys get your firearms?
We did many different methods.
I know the methods.
Well, actually, I purchased a lot of my guns from the gun store. I went in, filled out the thing, got approved for it. I purchased a number of my weapons from the gun store. And we worked on becoming very, very proficient at that. You know, one of the policies we had that, you know, whenever you went anywhere, we were always packing. You know, we always had a weapon on us at all times. And we never went anywhere alone. We always went in twos, you know, which would play into another situation, you know, a little bit down the line. But a lot of the weapons that I got, I purchased them legally, you know, from gun stores.
What was your, just knowing your mom, what was your mom's reaction to you and doing this within the community?
Probably, you know, my mom was, she was a typical mother. She was concerned and worried about me. You know, she was always concerned that I was going to be okay. She was always glad to see me walk through the front door at the end of every day, you know, because she knew at least I was alive, you know, for that day. And so she was, but my mom didn't have, you know, she didn't press me in terms of being critical, you know, or disagreeing with me with what I was doing. And she was, my mom was a pretty smart lady. She was very wise, you know, in how she handled me.
So let's move a little bit forward to, it officially started in 67, 66?
66.
66. Mm-hmm. 69 rolls around. There's an incident that occurs. Can you walk us through this incident? Because I know in speaking with you that you feel you should have been there. It should have been you. So yes. Can you talk about this incident that occurred with Officer Sasser?
Yeah, we had a situation where I had actually purchased two .45 automatics from a gun store in Santa Ana. And I had to wait the 5-day period to go and pick those weapons up. And so, but the owner was nice enough to say, I'll open on Sunday, that's when your approval will be in, you can come pick up. And I said, oh, you don't have to open up, you know. You know, one of the things about me, I was always very respectful to people. If people respected me, I was very respectful to them and very considerate of them when people did things for me. So I told the owner, I said, you know, I can come in Monday. He insisted that I come in Sunday. So I go in Sunday, I take about 3 or 4 of the guys with me. While he's selling me the gun, Otis Grimes steals a gun from his store. And it was a new particular model, it was a .38 called an Airweight, you know, automatic pistol. And you know, my reaction to that was I was really kind of upset about it. And you know, and I wrestled with the idea of, you know, one of the things that some of the values I got from my mother was a lot about integrity, and from my dad. And my mom would always teach me and always push the issue of that. You need to treat people the way that you want to be treated. You know, she said, you can't go wrong if you do that. So, you know, I had some turmoil, you know, going on about that situation. I just thought, you know, the guy was so nice to me, you know, and you're going to steal the gun from him. And so, but even with all of that, you know, when your conscience is moving on you and pressing you and convicting you, the longer you wait to act on your conscience, you know, the lesser your conscience is affecting you, and then you can go on and do whatever it is that you want to do. And so eventually I didn't take the gun back, and we kept it. But we were meeting at a garage over in Santa Ana one night, and I was teaching classes on gun handling and breaking down and cleaning, and so Stevie Tice was there, one of the young guys was there, and he needed to go home. Well, we weren't going to let him walk home by himself. So we were on one side of town, he lived on another side of town. So I was going to walk him home, and of course, I was going to be packing a weapon. Not that particular weapon, you know, one of my own. So Arthur Lee stepped up and said, you know what, I got to go on that side of town, I'll walk him home. So we argued about it. I said, no, you know what, I'm going to walk him home. So we argued back and forth for a while. And so eventually, he did walk him home. And so that was the night. It was a Wednesday night during the, we talked about the dance at the El Salvador Center, you know, rec night. And it was at the time when the police were pulling over various groups of blacks. Well, while Arthur and Stevie were walking, basically in the opposite direction, they just got pulled over. They hadn't done anything, hadn't jaywalked, but they got pulled over. And so one of the policies of the party, it was something that we said to each other and that they talked about at the party, was that, you know, if you're carrying a weapon, it's better to be caught with it than be caught without it. And one of the things they used to say was that you never let a cop take your gun. You know, that was just kind of an unspoken policy. It was a spoken policy. And so when the police officer pulled Arthur and Stevie over, and he patted Stevie down, and when he went to pat down Arthur, Arthur pulled a weapon on him. And so they went back and forth for a while, and Arthur kept telling the officer, he said, just you stand over there. And Arthur said, all I want to do is get away. You know, that's kind of how Stevie tells the story. He was an eyewitness to that. And eventually, it's said that the officer went for his weapon, and it was at that point that Arthur League shot him in the chest and killed him.
And so after all this occurred, what happened to Arthur?
Well, Arthur, he took off. Actually, him and Otis Grimes took off, and they went into hiding. And it wasn't too soon after that that the police raided my home and arrested me and charged me with that murder.
So let's walk through that day where the police raided your house. What do you remember? And when did you first hear about the shooting and all that occurred? Because you weren't there.
Well, you know what? We were at this office we had set up in the garage over in Little, Texas, and so it was probably about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Somebody came, knocked on the door, and came in and says a police officer has just been shot and killed. And so, you know, our thought was, because you know, if you knew Arthur League, I met him. He worked in a bank. He was a bank teller, and very straight-laced, middle-class kind of guy. Very soft-spoken, very intelligent. You know, his conversation was very intelligent. And Otis Grime, on the other hand, was considered more of a street kind of guy. You know, that was kind of his presentation. And so we initially thought it was Otis Grime. So we went looking for Otis. Went to his apartment, couldn't find anybody. Eventually, we just decided to go home. And that was Ricky Tyson, myself. So I just remember on the way home, and this is important because this will play in a little bit later on, you know, into my testimony. On the way home, there was a police officer in Santa Ana named Bob Stebbins. He was a sergeant in the Santa Ana PD, and Bob and I had we literally hated each other. We would see each other and we would threaten to kill each other and talk crazy to each other and everything. And so when I was on my way home, walking down the street, we walked past where the police officer was shot, which was on 3rd and Raich Street in Santa Ana. And I remember that Bob Stebbins was in a police car coming towards me as I was walking on one side of the street. And it felt like it went into slow motion, you know, like in the movies. And we were just mad dogging each other the whole time. He's in the car and he's leaning and mad dogging me, and I'm walking and I'm slow and I'm mad dogging him. And he just went past, and that's what we did to each other. But Bob Stebbins, you'll hear a little bit more about him later. But, and so I ended up going home, and my cousin's wife was there. She gets a phone call because at this point the police were ripping up the community. They were kicking in doors. They were grabbing grandmothers, children, mothers. They were putting them on the front lawn, and they were tearing up people's houses inside. They were looking for this person who did this murder. And so I get home. My cousin she says, the police are on their way over here, you know, to this house. And so I made the decision to stay there, you know. And so I decided that, you know what, if we're going to have a shootout, we're going to do this. So I gathered up all my weapons and my ammunition and everything, and I was ready, you know, for when they got there. And so I was at my mom's house, and so I actually checked all the doors and windows, and I was putting furniture up against doors, and I was ready, to go down with them at that particular point in time. So when they arrived, they came up on the front porch. They knocked on the door, and I had a shotgun in my hand, a 12-gauge pump. And they said, I said, who is it? And they said, it's the police. They said, open the door. And I said, do you have a warrant? They said, we don't need a warrant. If you don't open this door, we're going to kick it down. So it was at that point I racked around in the shotgun, and they broke off the porch, you know. And, some things aren't funny when they happen, but, you know, when you think about it, I could look out the window. They were running into each other and everything, so it was kind of comical, you know, later on. But so anyway, but I got to thinking about it, and my mom was actually on vacation in New York at the time. And I got to thinking about, I said, if I do a shootout with these cops, it's going to tear our house up. You know, there's going to be bullet holes everywhere in her furniture. And I just thought about how hard my mom had worked, you know, to buy this house, and all the sweat that she put into it, and her faithfulness, and just her hard work and her ethic. And I just thought, I really can't do that. I said, I can't do that. But looking back, and some of you know I'm a Christian, I attribute this to the fact, I believe God is sovereign, and I think you can only see the sovereignty of God by looking back, how God works and intervenes in situations and orders situations, for His good pleasure and purpose. So, looking back on all this, the thing of me not walking, Stevie home that night, the fact that I'm thinking this in the house about my mom, I just see God all over that, in my life. So eventually I decide to give up. So I take all my guns, I put them in our attic, I hide them up in the attic up there, and I gave up, and they came in the house, and there was one situation where they handcuffed me and they had me sitting in a chair in the living room. And this one officer came in that him and I were at enmity with each other big time. And I remember he came in and he sat next to me. And nobody else was in the living room but me and him. And he took out his .38 revolver and he stuck it to my head. And he says, I'm going to blow your brains out, you blankety blank. And I remember, and then he cocked it and he put his finger on the trigger. I could see it out of my peripheral vision. And I thought at that point that was it, that my life was literally over at that point. And so I remember he was in my face, I looked at him and I just said, whatever. And you know how they say you see your life flash before your eyes? I mean, not in fast motion, in real time. And that's kind of what my experience was. But eventually he pulled the gun down, and that's when I exhaled. And so that was one situation that happened there. So they arrested me, they took me down, they interrogated me, threatened me, they brutalized me a little bit, not real bad, and then booked me for first-degree murder and first-degree conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder.
And can you just play through that part? And obviously they didn't find you guilty and ended up finding that it was Arthur League, and how did all that play out?
All that played out is really interesting because Arthur League and Otis Grimes were actually found at, some of you guys will remember Donald Sutherland, the actor, Donald Sutherland. Well, Donald Sutherland was in Europe shooting the movie MASH at the time, but his wife was involved with a group called Friends of the Panthers. And that included a couple of professors from UCLA that was involved in this group. They raised money on the rich end, to fund the Black Panthers and, in their endeavors. And so that's where they caught Arthur League and Otis Grimes was there. So after they found out that, they got the facts that I wasn't involved in the killing, then they eventually took me to court and dropped the charges and released me.
And this kind of was the end of your tenure at the Panther Party. So what eventually led you to just leave the party, and why did it really just eventually end in Orange County?
Well, after all this went down with the police and everything, the party, we really couldn't be much effective from that point. Our office had been ransacked, all of our resources had been confiscated, so we really had nothing. So we decided I decided to go with the Los Angeles chapter of the party. So I went up there. I was studying Marxist-Leninism, and I would teach these classes every week on Marxist-Leninist philosophy and so on and so forth. And so, I had really fell in love with Karl Marx. I thought he was just absolutely one of the most brilliant people on the planet. And so I did a number of things. I did the Breakfast for Children. I did a lot of things with the newsletter. I did things in the community and working with some of the older people and helping people out. But one week, I was getting ready to teach a class, and I remember, and this was the catalyst that really kind of pushed me towards leaving the party for a strange reason. I opened the book to the next chapter. The title of the chapter was, "There Is No God." And I said, surely, Carl, this is a trick title to the chapter, surely a guy this smart would definitely believe that there is a God. And I believe that there was a God, as I shared with you earlier. When I was 7, 8 years old, I came to really understand the gospel, as full as I needed to. And so I remember as I read through the chapter, I realized that it was really, really real. And I was stunned. I was stunned, I was disappointed, and I thought, my hero doesn't believe in God. Now, why would that bother me? You know, at that point in my life, I had no interest in giving my life to Christ. I had no interest in serving God or doing anything like that. But it bothered me that he didn't believe in God. So, in kind of naive way, I thought, I'm in the Black Panther Party. We're all black. We have a history of church going, you know. And so I says, I bet nobody knows this about Karl Marx. I'm going to go back and I'm going to blow the lid off of this guy. And I'm going to tell everybody in the office, did you know that Karl Marx doesn't believe in God? I said, that's going to change everything, nationally and everything. When I go back to the office and I'm telling people this, and they're going, yeah, we agree with that. So I was really kind of stunned, but you know, I think, you know, God in his sovereignty is that he was drawing me to himself. And in that, that just really bothered me. You know, I didn't become less militant. You know, I didn't desire to go to church. I didn't desire any of that. But the fact that he didn't believe in God just bothered me tremendously. So eventually, probably a month or two after that, I became disillusioned just with that basic idea. And one day I just walked away from the party. I was out selling papers, and I just decided, you know what, I'm out.
And I think it's very, very interesting, because tell that story of the day that you left, because what happened right after that?
Yes, again, we have to go to the sovereignty of God on this. But I leave there, and I walk to my cousin's house. I have a cousin who lives in L.A. Probably took me 4 or 5 hours to get there. It was way on the other side of L.A. So I get there, I'm tired, she feeds me, I go to bed. About 5 o'clock in the morning, she wakes me up, and she says, you got to see the news. And so it was at that point that they instituted a coordinated raid on all of the Black Panther offices in Los Angeles. We had a house on Normandy, which was not too far from the Coliseum that I helped establish that house there. We had a house in Watts, on 103rd in Watts. And we had the main office, which was on 42nd and Central in Los Angeles. We had a couple other small satellite places. But they staged this coordinated raid on all the offices at the same time. I had just left out of the 41st and Central office, which was our main office, where there was this tremendous gun battle going on. And so I knew what was in the office. I knew what weapons we had. You know, I knew our defenses. I knew all of that. And I just sat there and thought, you know, I just left there, you know. But I got out, and a lot of the guys, you know, didn't get out. So.
Did you fear any sort of, think that there are going to be any consequences that you just took off? Did that play a part, or were you just done with it?
I was just done with it. You know, I figured there would be consequences because of the timing. You know, it would look like I leave just before the raid happened. So, you know, now I'm looking like I might have set it up, or I might have, you know, given some information and everything. But, you know, it didn't cause me any fear. You know, I mean, at that point in my life, I wasn't much afraid of much of anything. And so, you know, I ended up going back to Santa Ana, just as militant as I had ever been. And none of that changed. And I remember I had left my house one day, and when I came back, my uncle, who lived down the street, called me into his house, and he said, I got to tell you, he said, there were 6 guys that pulled up at your house. He said they had on black leather jackets, some of them had on long jackets. He said they knocked on your door, they walked around the driveway and around the house. He said they sat out here for about an hour and a half. He said then all of a sudden they left. So, you know, I figured that was probably guys from the Black Panther Party, you know, that had come to check up on me. You know, so, yeah.
But you're here now with us, so we're glad that
Yes.
everything worked out fine.
Amen.
Let's move forward, because 80s, I know that you had some really you had a really rough time in the 80s. Some drugs, some other things like that. Eventually,
That was more 70s.
70s?
Yeah.
But it led to you eventually going to prison.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think the prison point is really what brings you to your was a shifting point in your life in terms of your calling, right?
Yes, absolutely. I left the party sometime in 1970, and came back to Santa Ana, and now I was functioning as a lone wolf revolutionary militant, and I still did militant things. I went to an event at the Jerome Center in Santa Ana, where a lot of blacks hung out and everything, and they were having this event, and I just remember that it was a political season, it was the election season, and there was the chief of police and the district attorney and other city officials and councilmen, and I just remember I was so offended by that. I thought, you know what, they only come down here, when they want our votes. And so during the event, I sat in the first row, and when they announced the Pledge of Allegiance, I was the only one in the building to not stand up. So me and Carl, Kaepernick, we got that in common. So I was the only one to not stand up. And interestingly enough, when the event was over, as I was walking away and leaving, there was this older white man that was following me, and he just kept saying, "Excuse me." When I turned around, he introduced himself. He said, "My name is Lauren Gazette." He said, "I'm the mayor of the city of Santa Ana," and was shaking my hand. And when I told him, I said, "I'm Michael Lynem," he gripped my hand even harder. He got this smile on his face. He says, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." And, later on I'll share with that, kind of how that, why he was looking forward to meeting me. But that set into motion a series of events. I eventually went to work for the County of Orange in mental health. I was going to college. My major was, I was a psych major at that point. I was a co-director of a clinic over in Santa Ana. I had a patient load doing therapy. I worked with parole and probation, and worked with the Orange County sheriffs and some other groups. I did seminars, speaking seminars on trying to bridge the culture gap between law enforcement and some very interesting cultural aspects of the black community. Our communication, how we communicated with each other, with different definitions for different terms and words and so on and so forth. And so it wasn't long after that I got involved in drugs, and I also became a hairstylist. Work with this guy right here. We had a shop in Santa Ana called House of Naturals. So you know how far back that probably goes, right? That's me and Charles. And so during that period of time, I got involved in drugs, and so eventually I became my own best customer, and started doing heroin. I did a lot of cocaine. That was the thing back then, powder cocaine. And I got involved in heroin, and party was my big thing. If I was going to major in anything, it was going to be how to party. And so I worked hard to get my PhD in that, and because I was all about the party. And so I did eventually. I got involved in heroin. I became a heroin addict, and I was arrested in around November of 1978 for a series of crimes that I was committing to gain money to support my heroin habit. I was probably doing at this point about $200 a day of heroin. I look back at that, and I don't know, I came up with $200 every single day. It was absolutely amazing. I didn't miss a day. And so eventually it caught up with me. I got arrested, and I was sentenced to 6 years in state prison.
And where were you stationed in prison, or where did you go to prison? Where were you?
So I started at Chino in the reception center, and then they eventually transferred me to Tehachapi. That's where I did my time. And
it was in prison that you really feel like you got your calling. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was, to go back to Lauren Gazette, what Lauren Gazette ended up being a Christian. And so for about 10 years, from the time I met him up until I went to prison, he befriended me, that I just found absolutely amazing. He was very consistent. I wasn't nice to him, all the time. But he became friends with my mom, and I became friends with his family. And we'd go over to dinner at his house. He'd come over and bring his family over for dinner at our house. But he was just a consistent witness for Christ in my life. He just spoke into my life. He didn't preach to me. He didn't beat me over the head with the Bible or anything like that. But, it's, when I think back on it, I look back, I could see Christ in him. He was very gracious. He was very forgiving. He was just a guy, I would say some crazy things to him that I wasn't very nice, and he just would kind of look past it, But there was a love there that came from him, and I knew he was praying for me. I knew that my mom was praying for me, and who else knows was praying for me at that particular point in time. So, and so my life during my drug days was it was a lot of turmoil there, because I'm getting drugs but I'm running into people who are speaking the gospel into my life, during that period of time. And so by the time I get to prison, I was feeling pretty broken. I was realizing that, I'm this vile, wretched sinner, and, I can't run my life. I'm making a mess out of it. And so I went to chapel one day, and when they said anybody wants to give their life to Christ, I submitted to that. And so I gave my life to the Lord. Well, I wrote Lauren a letter. And I told him, I said, Lauren, and here I am, I'm in prison, I'm getting ready to serve 6 years in state prison, but I had this joy, I was just full of joy at that point. I mean, I really didn't care, and I sensed that God had really come into my life, and he had done some amazing things in my heart. So I wrote Lauren a letter to tell him that I had given my life to Christ, thanking for his prayers. Well, I get a letter back about 4 or 5 days later, but the letter wasn't from Lauren Grisette. It was from, remember that cop? We were mad dogging each other? The letter was from him. It was from Bob Stebbins. And Bob Stebbins, unbeknownst to me, had also come to Christ at a particular point in his life. He had given his life to Christ. And that started a friendship and a relationship that lasted for decades, and Lauren and Bob Stebbins and a couple other Christian police officers actually came to the prison, and spent time with me and visited me on the yard, and we spent some wonderful time together in fellowship in that.
I remember you sharing with me a story that occurred to you about the riot in prison. Do you want to share that? Because I just think it's an incredible story.
Yeah. Well, in prison, you have a very cut and dried racial lines. You had your blacks at the time. The black gang was called the BGF, or the Black Guerrilla Family. You had your white gang, that was the Aryan Brotherhood, and you had your Mexican gang, which was the Southern California, the Southern Mafia was what it was. And so there was these clear racial lines drawn in prison. And so one day I was on one yard, and on another yard this riot broke out between the blacks and the whites. And me and some friends of mine, some other Christian brothers, we were sitting on the yard. And so I said, you know what, guys, we should pray, and we should get off the yard, go in and lock up and everything. And so we agreed to do that. So we prayed, and when we got up to walk in, I remember somebody pointed across the yard, and there was this black guy that had been stabbed, and he was stumbling across the yard. And so at that particular point in time, I heard a scuffle next to me, and when I turned around, there was about 5 or 6 black guys had jumped one of the white guys that I was with, and me and I got to do the right thing, right? So I just stepped up and I yelled at them. I said, "Stop!" I said, "You leave this man alone." And so they actually stopped, and they took off running. But anyway, it saved his life, because I was convinced that if they had continued to beat him, that they would have beat him to death on the yard. So so at that point, I was getting threats from the Black Guerrilla Family that they were putting an open contract out on me to kill me. Things were coming down from other prisons, from Soledad and Folsom. From in the prison, they called the leaders shot callers. The heads of different gangs in there. And so they were saying they had to take me out. They could not let me get away with that. And I remember they had locked the yard down, when nobody could go in the yard. And I was in my cell, and they were getting ready to open the yard. And so I was praying. One of the guys had come to me and said, "You know what, you need to lock up in protective custody. These guys are killers, they're going to kill you." And I just told him, I said, "You know what?" I have to put my faith and trust in the Lord. I said, whatever he wants is what I want. So that next morning I was praying. I was on my knees praying, asking God to guide me, and whatever he wanted me to do, I was willing to do it. And I remember when I looked up at my Bible, and it was in a passage in Proverbs that said, when a man's ways please the Lord, he'll make even your enemies be at peace with you. And so it was at that point that I got a peace in my heart, and I felt I got a very clear answer, from the Lord as to what I was to do. So at that point, I walked the yard. I mean, I got dirty looks, I got threats, I got this motion and the stabbing motion and everything. But I believe, God protected me and covered me in that situation, and nobody ever laid a hand on me. And at a certain point in time, one of the leaders of the Black Gorilla family came to me, at nighttime. It was at night one night, and he asked me. He says, I'm going to ask you a question. He said, I want you to tell me the truth. He said, don't lie to me. I said, I won't lie to you, I promise. He was a pretty big guy too, really buff. And so he said, here's what I want to know. He says, it can only be one of three things. He said, either you are crazy. He says, you're stupid. He said, or this God that you serve is really, really real. He said, I want to know which one it is. And so, I told him it was the God that I served that was really, really real. And he told me if I ever told anybody that he came to me, he'd call me a liar. But and he left. I never saw him again. But I spent the rest of my time in prison. I was safe, and had an opportunity to use that situation as a testimony to a lot of other guys in there.
So let's move forward. So what are you doing now? Let's talk about. Obviously, we've heard about you giving your life to God and giving your life to Christ. So, I mean, how has that been for you? And obviously, I'm sure it's great. And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. It's been 37 years now. And it's been absolutely. I don't think I could have made a better decision in my life about anything, than giving my life to Christ. I like to say that living for Christ is an adventure. I like to say that Indiana Jones and the superheroes, they got to be jealous. Because, there's nothing, there's just living for Christ is exciting. It's, it's adventuresome and everything else. So God has brought me, quite a ways in these 37 years. And so now I'm attending a church, which is well represented here. It's my people right there, Kindred Community Church up in Anaheim Hills. And I'm doing something that I love to do and that I really feel God has called me to. And that is, at this point in my life, pouring my life into younger men. Okay? One of the problems, and we're working on a couple of ministries together, a couple of guys here that I'm working with, that I'm so blessed to have them in my life. One of the problems is that we see in the Black community specifically, I'll speak to that, is that the greatest threat. What is the greatest threat to the Black community, really? And I've determined that it's not racism. It's not the Republican Party. It's not Donald Trump. It's not conservatives. It's not the Democrats. The greatest threat to the Black community is the absence of fathers. That's the greatest threat to the Black community. In this particular time that we live in right now, we find that a Black child being born today and growing up in this country has only a 25% chance of growing up in a two-parent household. And we just know from history, if you just eliminate the Bible and the scriptures, from history, if the family is destroyed, it destroys the community. If the community is destroyed, it destroys a nation. And I think that's what we're seeing, in this country today. So, 75% of the births in that situation is out of wedlock births. So you got a lot of single mothers out there trying to get it together. I was looking at some stats in Philadelphia because, our ministry, we talk about racial reconciliation, but, in the Christian context, in the context of the gospel, we're looking at going beyond this whole issue of racial reconciliation to the issue of ethnic reconciliation, because when a person comes to Christ, regardless of what your nationality is and all of that, we're all one in Christ. So we believe as Christians that there's only one race. There's not many races, but there's many nations, and people. And so in Philadelphia alone, I just realized this stat that I pulled up is that cross-ethnically, any child cross-ethnically born today has a 10% chance of growing up in a two-parent family. And so that's, I mean, that's a devastating statistic, I think, because if you don't have good, strong fathers, you don't have good, strong families. And the children that come from that are just going to fall into that same trap over and over and over again. So our goal and what we're looking to do is to take the gospel into the community, and we're looking at going in the worst parts. We want to go where the gangs are. We want to go where, where the drug addicts are, and the worst part. I find out that people who come from that kind of background, who give their life to Christ, they become extremely radical for the gospel. They are so thankful for their salvation that they become extremely radical, for Christ. So that's kind of our goal.
So reflecting back, we'll finish in a few minutes. Reflecting back on your life, what do you just think of everything that you've experienced, everything that you've encountered, all the people that you know?
Well, yeah. I think back on my life, and I think about a lot of my failures. And I was married twice. I said, I failed as a husband. I wasn't the husband that I should have been. Wasn't the father that I should have been. And I made a lot of bad, poor, what I call stupid decisions, in my life. And there's consequences for that. But in being a Christian and coming to Christ, it's only in Christ that even my failures are redeemed. He redeems my life completely, from the inside out. So he can take my failures, and I mean, one of the scriptures I hold on to, Kevin, a lot is Romans 8:28. It says, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. The promises of God are for the people of God. And so when I look back at my life, through all my failures, my stupid decisions, and a lot of things that I did in my life, it's in Christ that those things have been redeemed. I ministered to other people and to young men from a position of failure. That I did fail, but God has redeemed my failures, and now he's using those for the furtherance of his kingdom.
Very cool. Well, before we get to questions, because I want to open up the audience to some questions for you. Is there any last remarks that you want to share? Some of the things that maybe we didn't cover. I know we've talked for hours and hours on end, so we can go on for days, literally for days. But anything you want to share?
We did about 10 hours of interviews. Yeah, Kevin and I did about 10 hours. Just that. My life is focused around the gospel. Everything about my life, my politics. My life is not informed by my politics. My politics are informed by the gospel. It's the word of God that influences and informs my politics. So even though I'm basically, if you want to put a label on me, I'm a conservative through and through. I'm pro-life. I'm pro-family. I'm all of that. But I make decisions not based on what other conservatives make. I make decisions based on what the Word of God tells me to make. So I can be graceful to people where maybe other people aren't quite as graceful. I can be forgiving. I can be compassionate and understanding towards people because that's really, for me, what it's all about. So I would just say that if you don't know him, give your life to him.
I have one last question.
Okay.
What would today's Daniel tell 20-year-old Daniel, Black Panther Daniel, if you had a chance?
Man up. Get it together, dude. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah.
So now what we'll do is, if anyone has any questions, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Feel free to just raise your hand. I can probably pass this mic. I can give you this one, and we can pass this one around. Anyone?
Your beard. Oh, okay. How you doing? Number one. Thank you for coming, sir. I'm honored to have met you and known you. I'm glad you're here. Just giving us the details about what the Panther really was versus what the narrative is. So, and thank God for what God is doing in your life and what you're doing in so many other lives. I just want to say that I could go on and on. I am a student of history. I'm a student of the Black Panthers. I even reached out to him years ago And I think it was God, because it took years for us to actually meet. I seen his email a year or two later after he sent it. But he came to my salon. I own a barber shop in Irvine. He came to visit me, and we broke bread, and it was just an honor. And it's an honor to be here tonight to listen to you as well.
I'm glad you came.
Well, thank you. It's so much I want to say, but I want to get a mic to someone else. But it was a lot of other programs I could mention. I could mention the Mulford Act regarding Black Panthers carrying weapons, changed California's open carry laws. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to talk too much because I talk too much. But thank you for coming, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Daniel, I wanted to ask you about like kind of famous historical figures you've seen, because I know you mentioned you saw Jimi Hendrix once. Maybe you can talk about that, or just anybody else throughout history.
I did see Jimi Hendrix a couple times. I remember we went to, he was playing right after he came over from England. He was playing at the San Bernardino Fairgrounds. And so me and some friends went there to see him. And it was interesting because, Jimmy didn't really appeal to the black community, with his music. So I actually got a spot up front. I was sitting on the stage, and I remember in between songs, Jimmy looked down at me and he says, "Oh, there's a brother in the house." So that is ingrained in my memory, that Jimi Hendrix actually pointed at me. So yeah, that was great. Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of experiences with, with a lot of different people. I saw a lot of bands. I was really into music a lot. And so I saw a lot of the good bands and everything. Yeah, thanks.
We also didn't really cover it, but he went up to Oakland and obviously met with the Newton and all those guys.
Yeah, Bobby Seale. We went up there for a couple of rallies, spent time up there. Got a chance to talk with some of the Central Committee members up there. Had some pretty deep conversations, and so it was very good. I take all of my experiences. I look back on my life. I try not to have regrets, but I take all of my experiences. Being in Christ allows me to look at things through the eyes of sovereignty, and knowing that through all of this, God was providentially ordering my life and ordering the life of people around me who've come into my life, which has brought me to the point that I am. So I just try to have a very overall grateful and thankful attitude for all that the Lord has done for me.
Anyone?
Hey, Mike, did you ever meet Huey P. Newton?
I didn't meet Huey. Huey was actually still in prison at the time, but I did meet Bobby Seale.
Met Bobby Seale?
Yeah, and some of the other guys, Masai Hewitt, some of the guys that, Elaine Brown and I were pretty close, because she functioned out of the Los Angeles office for a long time. I used to travel with her to go pick up money and to go do speeches and things like that, so we became fairly close. Thinking about reaching out to her, so we'll see.
What about Angela Davis?
Angela I didn't meet. Angela Davis was more part of the Communist Party, USA, but, we had alliances and everything. Yeah, thanks.
Sir, thank you for being here. It's an honor to be here with you today. I have a question with your experience of having family in the South and looking at the two different approaches, from your parents' approach to being a little bit more passive and adapting to the environment, and your approach and how you went forward. And then considering that era of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and their two different approaches, do you feel, looking back, that your approach, you accomplished what you wanted, or would you have been more effective taking your parents' approach or the generation before?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think looking back, that I think that it would have been more effective and more sustaining if I took my parents' approach. That if you go back in history and you look at the at post-slavery, blacks knew exactly where they stood. And so they used the resources that they had, which brought together a strong sense of community and support from each other. There was a bond that was there, and through all of the adversity, I think, that we've gone through as a people, it built some very strong principles and values and character, in the lives of our people. And so you'll find that, in history, that that blacks said, well, they don't want to be bothered with us. We're going to start our own towns. We're going to start our own cities. And when they started those cities, using their resources and what they had, they were great cities, and great towns that functioned extremely well. Of course, people on the other side of the track, got angry about it, and they would go in and burn them down and kill the people. But, black people had such a sense of character and strength and values that we drew from each other, and that we drew from our experiences, down through slavery. I think we've lost that, today. I think there's too much of the blame game, of looking and saying, I can't get anywhere because the white man's holding me down. If I'd ever said that to my grandmother, I'd have probably got popped upside the head, because the message was, you can be anything you want to be, if you apply yourself. My mom used to always say, if there's a will, there's a way. And so she says, nobody can keep you down. You can only keep yourself down. We may have to work harder. We may have to be more diligent in what we do, but we can get it done. So, that's our goal. I think the gospel, it infuses in a man a sense of dignity and pride, when you know whose you are, and being the fact that now you actually possess a power that is outside yourself. And I think that goes to building up men, making men strong, making them godly, and I think you create some tremendous fathers, and I think that's what would be a resurgence, of our communities.